Bienvenidos a esta nueva edición de Trading, Risk and Beyond. Soy Gerardo Herrera, su anfitrión. En este programa, como siempre, les traemos lo último y lo mejor de los líderes y los protagonistas del mundo de las finanzas. En esta ocasión, tendremos un programa doble. Barings, la caída. Barings Brothers, el banco británico mercantil más antiguo del mundo, se vino abajo a finales del siglo pasado como resultado de las operaciones ilegales de su trader estrella en la mesa de derivados de Singapur, Nick Leeson. Nick Leeson está el día de hoy con nosotros para conversar sobre lo sucedido, para conversar sobre gobierno cooperativo, sobre administración de riesgo y sobre todo, si esto podría volver a pasar. Acompáñenos a escuchar esta fascinante historia de un desastre financiero. Whose blame was it? The Bank of England, the auditor Cooper's Lybrand, the internal processes at Barings, CEMEX, your partners, your boss, your colleagues at the bank?
Well, look, the responsibility is all mine. You know, it was me that initiated all of the trades, and therefore, you know, the responsibility, the accountability has to stop somewhere, and that was very much with me. But as I said already, you know, incompetence and negligence was everywhere, and it was through every one of those organisations. I mean, any of those parts of either the internal organisation or the external surveillance that was going on, any of them could have stopped the collapse sooner than they did. But they were incompetent, they were negligent, they weren't very good at their job, and for those reasons, I was able to continue as long as I did. And probably the only real catalyst that brought around the collapse was that Barings were running out of money. They had no more money to fund the margin calls that we were having in Singapore, and I couldn't keep it going any longer. But you know, throughout the 3 years, there was an asset liability committee. People did used to meet and discuss the margin that we had in Singapore. Capital base of the bank was only about £300 million. I had 600 million with me in Singapore, so they were unable to use money or capital where they really chose during that period. But still, they didn't ask the tough questions. And it was funny. I was doing a dinner or a lunch a couple of years ago in the City of London, and one of the ex-board members of Barings came along, a guy called Trevor Slaversky. Trevor was one of the best warrant traders in the world. Trevor was on the asset liability committee. And what he explained to me is that when they brought up issues surrounding me at the ALCO meetings, Ron Baker, who was my immediate boss, he would stop the conversation dead. And Ron was a Barings Brothers employee who was brought into a Barings Securities type of role. And again, that consolidation or that organisational change didn't happen correctly. But Ron, over those years, became a very effective foil for what I was doing, because he didn't understand it. He didn't understand the business that I was in. Rather than ask questions, he would just deflect and stop the conversation going there. And that's what Trevor explained that to me. I mean, I think when you look at leaders and organisations, I think historically, society has always wanted unambiguous leaders who know the answers, but the best leaders are the ones that ask questions if they don't understand. You don't find too many of them. You know, you find a lot of people who will try to convince you that they know, they understand, and they have the knowledge. But you find very few who will ask those difficult questions. And if you look at risk in marketplace or in any business, it is because people still aren't asking the difficult questions, because it may make them look silly because they don't understand, they don't have the degree of understanding that they should. But that's because markets move on. So you have to continually update your knowledge banks, your understanding and your expertise, but a lot of people just stand still.
Okay, interesting point that you raised. If people had made questions earlier, what would you have done?
I wouldn't have been able to continue. It's simple. You know, nobody did a position check for 3 years. You know, the only people that did were the auditors, and they didn't investigate any further. If you look at the audit for 1992, the illegal 5/8 account is in the audit notes. It's in the audit points because some of the trade tickets weren't time stamped. But they didn't then ask what is the 5/8 account. So, you know, it's a lot of people were going through the process, and you see a lot of what happens in these control functions is process driven. It's a box ticking exercise, but you need to get behind the boxes and understand what all of the information means, and then challenge. And you know, I was never challenged throughout that 3-year period. The only time I was on February the 23rd, 1995, when somebody brought the position check to me and said, "Can you explain the discrepancy?" There is no explanation. The discrepancy is the illegal 5/8 account. But a 9-year-old could do this computation. You know, there were only 2 accounts, a London account, Tokyo account. You add them together, you compare them to the position at Cymex. There's a huge discrepancy, probably a 10-fold discrepancy on what the position is at Cymex. And the reason for that discrepancy is my illegal trading. And so on the 23rd of February, when it was shown to me, the first time in 3 years, I ran away because there was no explanation. That was it. That was the end.
Why did everybody look the other way? Because of the money that was flowing in?
It's difficult for me to say, because you're asking me to try and understand what other people were thinking, and I can't do that. The only way that anybody will ever unearth that is to actually ask them themselves. And but I think it was a huge part of it. I think what you see in, you know, if I generalize a bit, if you look at financial markets and property markets and any sort of market in general terms, when things are good, everybody is carried along on the wave of euphoria, and then something goes wrong and people look at what they're doing again. That's not right. You know, you have to learn from history. It's there to be learnt from, not to be repeated. And unfortunately, I think over the years, over the last number of decades, it's been repeated far too often, and that's because people get carried away that the markets are good, everybody's making money. It's a one-way street, and it's not. You know, you need to control risk on an active basis. Otherwise, you know, things can go wrong.
What you did wouldn't be possible nowadays because of all the changes in the audits, the processes.
I mean, you say that, you know, but you've had Jerome Kerviel, you've had Kwaku Adeboli, you've had Bruno Ixil. I was at a very plush event in the City of London recently, and 50 of the biggest banks were there. And one of the questions that was asked by one of the big consultancy practices, I won't say who, one of the questions that was asked was, you know, how many rogue trading episodes have you had in your organisation this year? And so it was all of the big banks, the names that everybody knows. So there were 50 banks. If they've all experienced 5 rogue trading episodes within a 12-month period, that's 250 rogue trading episodes. So they get caught sooner because the controls, the systems and the people are improving. But Kwaku Adeboli didn't, and that guy was out of control. Bruno Ixil didn't get caught, and JP Morgan were trading against themselves. For me, it still goes back to people not asking the important questions and not challenging adequately. You know, you can use technology to remove some of the risk, but somebody still needs to understand the figures and the information that's coming out and use it and challenge what's happening. Because the information, I believe, is always there. You look at any of those scandals over the years, going from my own right through to the most recent episode. There were indicators that something was wrong, but they were ignored, and you have to question why they were ignored, and it's because people didn't want to ask the difficult question.
Getting to the issue at hand, Barings Brothers was going to so many changes in the years leading to the collapse. It could be said that you perform organizational arbitrage. How could that be possible?
It certainly wasn't intent. When you see financial fraud or financial scandal, it's often described as sophisticated and complex. And I think if you look at them all really and you drill down into the detail, it's not. I think if I was asked to give you one word to describe the fraud that happened at Barings, it would have to be crude. There was no clear plan. There was no concise sequence of actions. There was no intent. And it's funny you call it organisational arbitrage, and you can see that post-event. But at the time, that was happening very much subconsciously. There was a lot of incompetence and negligence around at the time. Mine was very much at the forefront. But people weren't asking the difficult questions. Barings was going through a transition. Barings Brothers was a 233-year-old merchant bank. Barings Securities, the part I worked for, was only 10 years old. And there was there was conflict between the two. They were very different in the type of business that they went after. But the money was being made by Barings Securities. And if you ask Peter Norris, who was the CIO of Barings at the time, what his biggest failure was, it would be that he didn't manage that organisational change correctly. And that's what he puts the collapse down more to anything else, that he didn't manage that consolidation as well as he should have. And obviously it did open up loopholes that I exploited, but they weren't deliberate exploitation. People weren't asking the difficult questions, and if I did get challenged by one part of the organisation, be that the risk manager or the compliance officer or one of the board members, I very much I had to think on my feet and respond. But if the people had actually ever shared the answers that I was giving, they would have seen that the answers were very different and didn't really make sense. But the communication was very, very poor. And if you don't have good communication within any organisation, financial or otherwise, it's very, very difficult to succeed and to survive and to make sure that you have all of your bases covered.
What made the difference between then and now?
Cavilla's was a bit more sophisticated in terms of the IT systems that he was using, whereas mine was, I would suggest mine was far more manual. But the level of the trading, the amount of margin required, the fact that the Bank of France or Eurex were concerned about the positions that Jerome was trading, they'd notified Eurex had notified SocGen, but nobody did anything. So it's inaction again. The information is there, you've just chose not to use it because either you don't understand or you don't want to ask those difficult questions. There's a phrase that the Wall Street Journal uses, which is to advertise their products, and that phrase is knowledge is nothing without understanding. And you can have a lot of people who are extremely knowledgeable, but if they don't understand how the component parts go together, you cannot challenge because you don't understand. So you can have a room full of knowledgeable people, but if you don't have one person in there who understands how it puts together, how it all feeds together, and is able to ask sensible questions based on that data or that information, then you're going to get nowhere. I'll give you a very easy example from my time at Barings. I remember, and this, it goes back to your first or second question as well. I remember getting a phone call one day whilst I was on the trading desk. I had a position limit of 250 lots, and I regularly breached it. So often 10, 20 times a day. And I got a phone call from the head of trading, and he was looking at the trade sheet for the day. The trade feed had gone back to London, and he was looking at trades for 2,500 contracts, and there were 10 of them. And so he phoned me up, and this was, the type of answer that I responded with. He said, "You've clearly breached your position limit. Why?" And I said, "Well, no, what you're looking at, you're not looking at that correctly. What the system does is it groups together trades at the same price." And he accepted that. It was a complete rubbish explanation, but the only thing that I could think of at the time But because he didn't understand the business and how the different parts fitted together, what he should have done is phoned Osaka and phoned the order clerk there and said, how did you receive that order? And he would have then been told it was to buy 2,500 at market times 10. And then my days would have been over then. But because he didn't understand how it fitted together, he didn't do that. And he accepted my explanation, and another year later, the bank collapsed.
What is your opinion? How do you think that the Jerome Curveil episode is going to end?
Should he go to jail?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I have no sympathy, empathy, or anything like that. You know what you're doing, and I knew what I was doing. I knew I shouldn't be doing it. I continued all the same, and therefore you have to take full responsibility for everything that happened. Curveil does. He knew what he was doing. The bank weren't initiating the trades. They weren't pushing him into it, and he should go to jail. I think a completely different response to that question. I think Curveil is deluded at this stage. He hasn't come to terms with what he did, and I fear for him personally, in that he needs to come to terms with what he did, because until you do that, you cannot recover and move forward. And so Curveil is still in this phase where he's blaming the bank and he's blaming everybody, and he's not blaming himself, and he needs to become responsible and become accountable for what he did. Initially it's by mistake, that's the only motivation, and to try to correct the mistakes and just get back to where you were before. And again, talking about somebody else who's deluded, Iguchi, who was the trader from Daiwa that surfaced fairly soon after the collapse of Barings, he's just written a book, and I think the biggest point that he makes in the book is that the bank should have allowed him to continue, because he was best placed to make the money back.
Okay.
That's ridiculous.
Absolutely.
So, but he believes that. He believes that the bank and the SEC and everybody was against him, and that he was scapegoated, and that he would have turned it around eventually. Transparency will outlast charisma. I was the outlier on every single metric that you could possibly think of. I had the most margin, I was trading the most, I had the biggest open position, I was reporting the most profit. Now, that should attract attention and investigation, not the opposite. You shouldn't just blindly accept that. You should look at what's going on. It got so bad that I think towards the end of 1994, you see sometimes with some of these financial scandals that the traders don't take holiday. I did. But when I took holiday, Barings were worried about losing money, so they asked me to go into the office in London and trade through the night.
Transparencia sobrevive al carisma, la gran enseñanza de esta historia. Acompáñanos a continuar esta interesante historia y discusión en nuestro siguiente programa sobre Barings, la caída. Le agradecemos mucho el estar con nosotros.